This is Gabriel Messuti, and you're listening to Learn, Unlearn, Optimize.
So we're back, Constituents of Food. Last time we spoke, we were talking about carbohydrates. Mike, my mind has just been really blown about the geometry and about complex carbs and simple carbohydrates and how it relates to the actual matter of like how something grows, and the more it pulls itself in and the more nutrient dense it is, the more complex the geometry is, and the composition of its form is, the more complex it is for our bodies and the way our bodies process it. And then the more something expands, and at the very end of its creation, the less complex and more simplistic it is as far as the carbohydrates are concerned and the structure. So it was really mind-opening and a great way for me to understand it, and hopefully for all our listeners also. So thanks so much for breaking that down. If you guys didn't hear our last episode on the Constituents of Food, carbohydrates, please check that out. And Mike, do you have any housekeeping from that episode you want to go over?
Yeah, I'm glad that your mind was blown, and I hope to blow it open even more.
Awesome, man.
My mind is constantly blown open by the things I learn, and in this field especially, and all the other fields that tie in with it, because everything is connected.
Yeah.
But yeah, we're gonna get more into, like you were talking about, the structures, getting more into the next level of like proteins. But housekeeping, I guess the key thing that we want to take home from that is that, and this ties into the next section too, is that there's this carbon-nitrogen cycle that we discussed, and carbon cycle, part of end of it representing the more growth and birth development.
Yeah.
Whereas the nitrogen side is more of the breakdown component.
Yeah.
Returning the recycling. And so carbon nitrogen cycle is within us. It's this whole relationship with the earth, how plant matter eventually will grow from carbon, then decay to back into the earth, where the bacteria will break that down, and then it's just a whole life cycle. So as we're going through all these talks, we just have to keep in these fundamental principles of life energy and how it works, and the growth cycle, or the life cycle of growth, maintenance, maturity, and then breakdown, and then recycle back in some other form. And so it's just energy transferring from one to the next. And in our own body, we have this similar cycle going on, where we're breaking up and breaking down, and everything has a life cycle. Each cell has a life cycle, and we want to replace older cells with newer cells, and make sure that those newer cells that are replacing the older cells are just as youthful and vibrant and vital. Because if they're not, well, this is where the degeneration occurs, and how we can get into chronic degenerative disease and aging, just in general aging. When we're getting older, it's because we have older cells that are sticking around and not enough new cells to replenish it. And that's because, we'll get into a little bit more of why that is, but in a nutshell, yeah, it's we lose the power, the reserves, the energy reserves to support that turnover rate, proper turnover rate. It just kind of slows down.
Mitochondria
are involved. Ultimately, it comes down to enzymes, which we'll get into with proteins. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Okay, so today's episode on the Constituents of Food, when we do proteins, that's a little segue that proteins and enzymes in proteins play a huge part in the regeneration, or the energy that a cell contains in order for us to regenerate. Did I hear that correctly?
So say it one more time so I can hear that.
So today, my audio level's okay, Mike?
Yeah, I'm adjusting it for myself.
Cool. Mm-hmm. So today on the Constituents of Food, we're going to do proteins. Mm-hmm. But what you just said was a little bit of a segue into the way that in order for our cells to have potency for regeneration, mm-hmm. You said it has to do with enzymes, and those enzymes have to do with proteins.
Yes.
And whatever you're about to break down is important, because that is what gives the new cells that enable this maintenance phase of our body, or this regeneration phase, or this not to get chronic disease or aging to happen is somehow contingent upon this relationship with proteins, this enzymes, and how it regenerates the cells. Is that kind of like a high altitude?
Yeah, that's a great big picture view right there.
Okay.
Yeah,
cool.
Absolutely.
Cool, man.
Yeah, so you definitely, you really nailed it.
Awesome.
I love that you have a good background on all this already. And so let's get into it for our audience who may not have that knowledge base.
Cool.
So proteins are, they're another level of structure. They're made up of, whereas like the carbohydrates that we're getting into are made up of more that carbon base. They're carbon. Proteins, they are definitely made up more of nitrogen, and so they represent more of that nitrogenous end of the carbon nitrogen cycle. And they're made up, the reason why they are is because they're made up of amino acids, and amino acids are composed of part of their composition is nitrogen. And they're important because proteins they provide both structure and function. And so all the proteins that make up our body and other organisms' body are there to provide some structure and function to that organism and its ability to, have its presence, have its existence, and perform all the functions it needs to perform for its life.
Okay.
So, proteins though, they don't really at the end, being that they're made up of amino acids, how do we go from that amino acid into a protein structure, which is a larger conglomerate? They're peptides. They're these chains of amino acids that fold in various configurations to create, another crystalline form, another crystalline structure, to have that ultimate structure and function for our being. But in order to get there, it needs to have the blueprint. It needs to have some direction on how those amino acids are going to be arranged into the proteins that we need to create so that we can do what we need to do. And that's where we have our genetic mechanisms. It's where we have our blueprint. That's all encoded in the DNA and the RNA. And so DNA, literally standing for deoxyribose nucleic acid, and then RNA, which is ribonucleic acid. They're unique compounds because they are literally the genetic, or making up the genetic mechanisms that are DNA to provide that blueprint, to make the proteins. So you have to think of like DNA almost like tuning forks within the nucleus, and they respond very much to electrical pressure. And what I mean by electrical pressure is it's all those forces that are radiating, that are coming at us, both from the outside, but also from the inside. It's everywhere. Everything that exists is because of electrical pressurization. And so when all of those elements that are on the periodic table experience some degree of electrical pressurization, it's going to react. It's going to form in some way into maybe a higher structure form. It might even transmutate into another molecule, another element. So with our DNA being like a tuning fork and detecting all the different stressors, these electrical pressures that are acting upon us, it's going to then start to stimulate, an appropriate response to be able to direct what needs to be created. So by the action of the DNA and the RNA working together at various levels in this process, it's going to start to, pull in the appropriate free-form amino acids and arrange it in a proper chain, a proper configuration based upon that innate genetic programming that we all have. We all have some shared genetic qualities, but we also have each of us have some unique genetic properties as well. And some of us have some certain genetic mutations that will alter what gets created.
So, Mike, can I recap that real quick, if
Please.
I may? Back to function before we get to the electronic stressors.
Yeah.
When you say we have a particular function that we're going to perform, right? Can you elaborate on what you mean by that?
Yeah. So our body has various functions. I mean, every organ system has a various function. Every cell has numerous functions. And so the cell, thinking of a cell as a basic unit of life, has to create various types of proteins in order to protect itself, in order to eliminate toxins, in order to bring in nutritional components, in order to build the structures that are needed to keep the cell membrane together,
Mike,
to communicate.
Before the cell becomes human, though, is the DNA, the RNA, this quote unquote like code. Is it going to tell what the cell's function is going to be and what type of animal or what type of being it's going to become?
Well, it's definitely encoded, and our DNA has roots very, very, very far in our past. So in every single one of us who is listening to this podcast, your DNA contains information that goes back to the most earliest ancestors on this planet, which is incredible. That's how we have been able to get from the very first humans species on this planet to where we are now. And
before that even became a human species, Mike, is it like the cell, there was one and then it split and then we crawled out of the water or whatever. And now there's I have a frog and there's a squirrel outside. So these are made of code, of DNA. Every being has this cell function, and is RNA and DNA respectively responsible for that squirrel that's outside, let's say, or the fox that runs, or the deer that people see, or whatever animal you want to visualize. Is that in other words, the code that says this is what
absolutely
this will be?
Yeah, it's essentially the biochemical molecules that are so-called henchmen of the genetic mechanisms that are inherent within us. Everything exists within the field, a field, and water, which we can get to another topic, is essentially a field.
Right.
And it's what everything is, life exists within this ocean, both internal and without.
Right.
But, water holds a vibrational field. And if you look into certain work by teachers like Rupert Sheldrake, brilliant human being, he talks a lot about this field in, name just escaping me right now, but morphogenic fields, and how they are these morphogenic fields that, basically have imprinted within it what is there to be, to the existence behind whatever gets created.
We were just talking about how snowflakes look different, Mike, how they look so techy. They look like little microchips and things like that. And is it Dr. Emoto's work with the water and how they can actually take on shape of the energy or these quote unquote electric fields or the information that's given it to it.
Exactly.
And then it'll transform.
Yeah, and just as an aside quickly, and that's what a lot of the physics, and especially the quantum physics and how they're getting into this, they're finding out that, actually more of reality really comes down to it's information at the fundamental source. As they're starting to break things down, it's not the particles, it's information, and then it's encoded within the particles and the relationships between those.
It's almost as if, Mike, we're not getting closer to AI. It's more like we're just getting closer to understanding the source code and revealing what is.
Yeah.
Right.
I like that.
So Mike, not to digress too much. So you have this RNA and this DNA that play, and then these cells basically get this quote unquote, for lack of better terminology, source code for what they're going to become. In this case, we're talking about humans and human proteins. And these human proteins basically respond to external stimulus and the pressures, similar to, I guess a good analogy is the piezo technique, to where if you take a certain amount of pressure and you apply it to a compound, it'll produce an electrical charge.
Exactly.
And you can like
Because the
press it.
electrical effect.
Right.
Yeah.
And it'll like, you can make a little doorbell, a little LED, and then you can take it from there. And I know like our bones, you can press on the human body and create that.
Correct.
And now we're taking it a step further to where it's kind of invisible to our eye, but visceral. The more awareness we have, to where Wi-Fi, cell phones, our environment, to where this electromagnetic input can affect the cell and have it mutate based on our DNA and RNA. And so in certain cases it could be cancerous. In certain cases it can turn into whatever it's going to turn into. But we're bringing in this information, and this different vibration and these different stimulus are creating pressure.
Yes.
An outside quote unquote stress on the body. And based on your external environment, that external stimulus, it will then, and your DNA and this RNA will then depict a certain outcome, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. I love what you said. That's exactly how it goes.
Cool, man.
I love how you understand it so well.
Thank you, Mike. I'm with you thus far, my friend.
Yes.
Okay, brother. Keep it going, man.
Yeah, so you're right. And that's the thing, is that we can have too much electrical pressure acting us that will start to break down those processes and start creating damage to our proteins, creating damage to DNA and RNA, which will then affect what actually gets created. But yeah, in terms of getting like, what is this process, like how we build our proteins and how do plants build their proteins, it all is embedded in this, the information is embedded in the DNA. And as it opens up and responds to those pressures, creating what needs to be created. And so we get these proteins, and also a large part of the proteins that we create are enzymes. Enzymes are actually very unique proteins that make our biochemistry possible. Without enzymes, biochemistry would not happen. Biochemical processes might take literally millions or billions of years, but now you introduce an enzyme that happens in a micro of a second, so even less. So enzymes are incredible in what they're able to do, and really what they're about, like their main function is to create our body and create energy. Ultimately, it comes down to those two, denominations. And there's always subdivisions, but really that's the primary, goal of enzymes, is to create ourselves and then to create the life energy that we need so that this body can move forward in time and space. And it's all about enhancing our power and our life energy. It's really what we're looking to do. So, again, back that every organ system that we have has a certain amount of protein compounds and also enzymes in there for that organ system to not only perform, but to communicate with all the other organ systems. It's a lot through these enzymes. And, for instance, you got your thymus, which is your first primary organ system that is crucial for protection, for our defense system. And so it creates all these enzymes that are important for creating the compounds for defense for our white blood cells. We call white blood cells T cells because T for thymus. So thymus is one organ system, but you got numerous organ systems that are loaded with organ system specific enzymes that do specific things on behalf of that system.
Which, FYI, and a side note,
Yeah.
Mike, when we're born, they say that what the thymus is like a little, or as we're still in the growth stage, the thymus is like a little clementine or tangerine type size.
Yeah, like a walnut size.
Right. And then by the time I've heard that they've when people now pass, based on all the external quote unquote stressors and the smog and the pollution that we're getting, the thymus gets such a hit, which is why the immune systems get weakened. It's like a shriveled grape. So you're going
Exactly.
from like a walnut to the thymus going down to a shriveled grape. So
Yeah.
I don't know if you can see Mike's necklace protecting his thymus. And I don't have a Q link right now, but I used to have a Q link. I lost. I got to get another one. But if you can find those necklaces, that will help to actually capture the stressor, the electromagnetic smog, or the electromagnetic frequency that's going to be blasting you from this microphone, from this computer, from this light, from the dirty electricity in my wall. Whole nother podcast. Sorry, Mike. Continue. My bad.
No, that's a really good point. Something that I wasn't going to discuss. That is such important information, and yeah, we could definitely use other crystals and other technologies to to help protect ourselves. I mean, I don't think we should ever reduce stressors in general. Like, we always want to stress the body because that allows the body to grow and to adapt. That's why it's really important to, strengthen your bones and your muscles. For instance, you have to exercise. You have to apply, as you were getting before, about the pressure to stimulate, the muscle growth and the bone, growth and development, and strengthen those tissues. So our body needs stressors. It needs radiation, or needs electrical pressurization to move out, because everything is like a pulse. Everything. Remember talking about cycles and patterns?
Yeah.
And like, you need, your life energy is very much like a pulse. You've got a pulse. How do you know someone's dead? You take the pulse, it's flat, there's no pulse. And so everything is this pulsation within our cells. And, that's just what's happening in every single one of our cells too. There's literally, electromagnetic, frequencies of every cell of our body. And that's very pulse-like. It's going in and out. And you definitely want to stress the body. But when you're having too much of especially a specific type of, radiation or electrical pressurization acting on you over and over and over again, that's going to actually create something called allostatic overload, where this term allostatic or allostasis is the ability to maintain stability through change. That gets overloaded, that ability. And so then you start getting into these alterations and this pathology where now you're not able to respond to the environmental stimuli, whether it's on the internal or the external, appropriately. And so there's all these alterations that are in a more pathological state. So, we got to be able to support, again, enzyme function, efficiency, and also reserves, because proteins are, enzymes are a big component of the proteins that we make, and they make what life possible. And so when we're going through life, different organ systems, if they're being hit hard over and over and over again, their enzyme reserves are going to be depleted. And then you're going to develop some chronic degenerative disease associated with those, let's say, configurations of organs that are not holding up enough on their reserves or their life energy and their enzyme
because at the cellular
capacity.
level, the cells aren't being regenerated with potency.
Yeah, they're not regenerating properly. They don't have enough of the proper enzyme activity to conduct what they need to conduct. Whether it's creating something, building something, breaking something down, transmutating something, detoxifying something, taking something into it. Enzymes are responsible for everything that happens in biochemistry.
Mike, are there certain types of enzymes? Mm-hmm. Are there certain types of enzymes?
Absolutely. There are enzymes that will split things apart, enzymes that will add things together, enzymes that will transmutate.
So if I wanted to study, is there like a certain amount of enzymes, or is there an enzyme chart? Is it like vitamins? Like
it's a whole study, studying enzymology. Okay. But, for the sake of like what we want to get to is, what do we do to take care of ourselves so that we can support our enzyme reserves, which is going to result in our body having a greater, energy production and capacity, so that our whole life energy goes up. And then what is the end result is we can regenerate.
Yes.
And prevent degeneration. And so this is where food is extremely important, which is why I'm going to then tie into the protein of food.
Mike, do do different organs require different enzymes, or is it overall?
Absolutely. And different organs create specific enzymes
Amazing.
that are needed for their own structure and function, and also to communicate with other organ systems and networks.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Sure is.
It's a whole world, a whole
man.
incredible world, and we're learning more and more every day,
Yep.
which is fantastic. Yeah. So what do I want to say about like enzymes? So in order for those enzymes to function, and also for them to often be created and to actually have their activity, they need coenzymes. It's like, what is coenzymes? You know, throwing in a whole nother word. So coenzymes essentially are those essential, meaning you can't create them, but these are essential vitamins and minerals.
Yeah.
And those are essential components that we need because they act as coenzymes working together with enzymes for those enzymes to have activity, to do what they need to do. And so that's what it brings down to food. And we'll get into, not today, but when we get into the whole vitamin and mineral conversation and more in depth, we'll get more into the specifics. But just as the overview, we need to eat nutrient-dense food that's loaded with, naturally occurring whole food complex vitamins, minerals that are food-based. So, you can use sometimes synthetic ones, but, only with a trained practitioner as far as I'm concerned, and stick with food because that's going to help enhance your enzyme's ability to be created and also for them to have the activity required to support your regeneration.
And like we said in the first episode and throughout the episodes so far, that when you're eating whole foods, you're not just taking in a fraction of something. So right. Without a trained professional, if you're taking in a fraction, it could, while it's benefiting something else, damage another. So eat whole foods. Exactly.
Eat whole foods, baby. Yeah. And this is why also it's important to also understand too that, for enzymes to work, not only do they need these vitamins and minerals, but they also need to, your body as a whole doesn't need to be experiencing a tremendous amount of what you were saying earlier about these stressors, a stress overload. Because when we have huge fluctuations in our stress response, when we have, huge amounts of electrical pressures are acting upon us, it changes the field and it changes the internal environment such to a level that things like our body's pH level will start to be altered and other things will be altered. And then the enzymes, their function gets to be altered because they need to be in a proper pH. It's appropriate to, wherever system that they're located in order for them to function. So if we think about our digestive system, enzymes that we put out from our stomach and primarily our pancreas, those enzymes, they function within a certain pH range at various steps in the digestive process. And so if we're having any, let's say in the digestive system, if your stomach, for instance, or pancreas is experiencing too much electrical pressurization where it's now starting to break down, and the pH is changing, it's not able to put out the right enzymes that are needed, or maybe there's too much acid in the gut because you're not breaking down the food, or you're eating the wrong types of food that are creating more of an acidic environment or too much of an alkaline environment. That's going to also affect the activity and efficiency of those enzymes to do what they need to do. So we got to keep that in mind as well with diet. So do you want to get into now like protein as a food source?
I mean, as a listener, Mike, yeah. I would love some answers before this is done. We got another about 15 minutes or so.
Okay.
Just like a brief overlook at some beneficial foods or something beneficial that we can start with as a foundation that can start this process that you recommend that can start the process of good enzymes being introduced into the body that are kind of that overlap one another, so to speak?
Yeah. So going back into our first conversation about, true real food, whole foods, whole foods that are coming from this, this planet, this earth primarily, well, from this earth, but primarily plants, I mean, they're loaded, in these enzymes. And when we eat these foods, we're getting these whole food complexes of enzymes paired with the appropriate vitamin and minerals in a whole food complex, so that when we consume them, we don't have to start to pull from other parts of our body in order to allow what needs to be processed. So by eating whole foods, we're getting those enzymes, we're getting those proteins, those amino acids, those building blocks, so that we can make our enzymes very efficiently. And the more that we focus on, let's say, raw living foods, where we haven't cooked the food, because by cooking, we destroy, or the term is called denature,
Or alter
our protein.
Yep.
We alter them, we allow them to disturb their structure. And again, structure necessitates or dictates the function. So if we denature those, break them down into smaller peptides or even free-form amino acids, now we have to be able to take from that and start to rearrange that into what we need to do. And on some level, that's important, and we do that. But it's also important to be eating, a certain degree of raw living foods, because that's really going to spare our own body from having to put out a certain amount of, let's say, digestive enzymes to break down that food. So when you look at a certain food, even like, I'm just going to use the dairy example, that has lactose, a milk sugar, there's also inherent within it lactase, an enzyme that helps break down that food. But that's only going to be found in, let's say, raw milk. I'm not saying to everybody go and start drinking raw milk. That's your decision. There's pros and cons against that, of course. But even certain foods that, let's say, have fats, or oils, there are fatty acids, but there are also enzymes in that food that helps break down that fatty acid. But that's what's wonderful about plants, is because they pair these things together. They provide all these things together.
Yeah.
And the more we can properly process a raw living food, such as, let's say, nuts or seeds, or grains, by sprouting them, we're able to get them to a more active state. Because remember, what a seed is it's in this dormant state, and so things are not so active. But there's all these things we can do to start to get it activated, and that's through a germination process, a sprouting process, to activate that. But it's important to get those foods into us. Unfortunately, a lot of us, though, are walking through life with just a lot of GI, that gastrointestinal distress, not always by the food that we eat, but by other life factors, other psycho-emotional, mental realm factors and influences that really distress the GI, the gastrointestinal tract, and our digestive power. So there's plenty of people out there who are eating, living raw food diets that their digestion is still poor and their health is still poor. Yeah. So I just want to add those things, because sometimes people will take a statement like, oh yeah, raw living foods have all these enzymes, so let's just eat all raw living foods. Yeah. And then they go all the way to that, end of the spectrum, where there's issues there. So there is something to be said for, cooking food and processing it in a way to liberate some of those important nutrients that you can't get just by eating it raw. One of the prime examples is mushrooms. You really can't absorb much from mushrooms, so the nutrients are really ingrained within the basically it's a carbohydrate based fiber form that the nutrients are embedded within. And so in order to break that down or soften that fiber up, you have to cook it, mostly, or break it up into some other type of mechanical way. So there's something to be said for processing our food in a certain way. You don't have to cook the thing to death, but there's proper ways to cook our food, to process our food, and that's all rooted in our human traditions, our cultural traditions that we have to embrace and not ignore.
Right. Well, a lot of a lot of the cultural traditions, though, that we embrace may not be the best choice for cooking or for not cooking.
Yeah, I'm talking about the ones that are rooted, talking about like thousands of years,
Yeah.
tens of thousands of years that aren't anything new. For instance, like there are certain traditions, yeah, where they, it's based upon what I said in the previous conversation or
Right.
episode about how we
Right.
eat to satisfy our sense of smell,
Yeah.
our sense of smell and taste, and we
So,
have to live beyond that.
Mike, did another door just get opened as far as the chemical composition or the composition of the food based on how it should be prepared? Is that a whole nother conversation? Like so, mushrooms, for instance, like
Yeah.
that was really eye opening for me. So, it doesn't depend if it's a shiitake or a reishi or a cordyceps, like, and then how I break that mushroom down. Should it be processed first and then cook lightly, not to bring over a certain amount of heat, just like tea?
Yeah.
So is this
Exactly.
and is this a whole nother conversation now for like, and what about kale? And what about, and like this based on each complex carbohydrate. So these all have carbohydrates, complex or simple carbohydrates, and all contain some type of proteins because of the carbon nitrogen cycle.
Yeah, we both every organism is always going to have proteins and carbohydrates within it.
So we want to get this nutrients, but then when we prepare, we don't want to kill all the enzymes that are going to help reactivate and rejuvenate our system. So there's different ways now. What I heard is that, hey man, there's a whole nother conversation, a whole nother study we could do on based on this, the way each thing is made up, in this case, a mushroom, and which mushroom it is, how we can break that down and the best way to prepare it for optimal enzyme intake.
Yeah, and nutrient intake.
Yeah.
And that's what I meant. Like that's really well rooted in our ancient traditions, where we know, especially in certain cultures more than others, how to prepare, let's say, green tea or other types of herbs. And good herbalists know how to work with plants in that regard. They know, okay, well, here's a root. The roots are very tough. We're going to have to cook that for several hours at least at high heat, versus, let's say, a leaf, which you may want to cook at a lower heat for a shorter period of time. Because there is that fine line between helping to extract and bring out some of those nutrients for maximum absorption, and there's that line of demarcation between getting that and now destroying those nutrients and breaking them down where they're not usable to us. And maybe also, not maybe, but often too, when you start to over process something, it then generates toxic compounds.
Wow.
And so one of the worst compounds that we, especially as Americans and a lot of people in the industrialized world all throughout the globe, are, what we're doing is we are over processing and cooking fats and oils, which are some of the most dangerous foods to consume, are damaged, rancid oils. So we'll get into a little more in depth about oils in the next episode.
Yeah, that's a big conversation for me, Mike, because like I specifically will buy like a high heat avocado oil so that it doesn't burn, and it's made to go to a high heat. So if that's healthy or not, I got a ton of questions on that.
Yeah.
But something that came up for me while you were just speaking was, we spoke about how in modern day, a lot of our soil is already not that nutrient dense anymore.
Right.
So now we're taking the very little bit of nutrients that's left in this food that we may be getting, and we're killing it by the way we prepare it. So even if we are eating whole foods, if it wasn't grown in a very nutrient dense place, doesn't have a lot of nutrients in it, maybe somewhat empty to begin with.
Yes.
And then by the way we're prepping it, we're killing everything. So it's amazing we're still even alive, Michael.
Well, that speaks to yeah, I'm with you. I say that actually quite often.
Yeah.
Like, it's amazing, like with all the abuse that we experience from the physical realm, toxins, but also the mental and emotional, spiritual
Electrical.
stressors that we experience, and the electrical, everything that we're taking on. That just shows like literally the resiliency of life and life energy, and how life energy is always trying to organize itself into higher and higher forms, and become more organized, resisting the physical, the physics, force of entropy,
Yeah.
that's trying to break everything down and make things more random, where you have this principle of like life energy, that's trying to make things more organized. And they're actually two sides of the same coin as far as I'm concerned. But yeah, where was I with this? Just
while you're catching your thoughts, Mike, something else that came up.
yeah.
And we're talking about in the other episodes, not only what you take in, not only how we process, not only how we digest, how we assimilate, but also how we eliminate.
Right.
And something that I like to think about a lot is, in a past episode also, we spoke about like, I liken the systems to construction systems. So like my plumbing, and my electrical, and how am I going to optimize these systems. And something that I like to take into consideration is like, okay, well, if I've had meats or I've had something, what am I going to eat that's going to help to go through my pipes like a pipe cleaner, and like literally like help clean that out. So I'll intentionally try to find something that's like nutrient dense, but not cook it too much so that it's going to be very like rough in my system. I visualize it like scraping the insides of my system like a pipe cleaner, like not cook too much kale or like apples and pears and things like that will go through and help to like be a little rough in my system to help elimination and cleaning.
Well, I like that. It's definitely a visual that I think is exciting, invigorating for some of us. Yeah. Some of us, it's a little scary. Yeah. But, I'm really a proponent of like, let's not force anything or try to control anything in regards to the body. Let's give it what it needs. And, it will find that balance, that healthy balance for itself. And you don't have to do these like, people are going out there doing intense cleanses, whether they're gastrointestinal, GI bowel cleanses or liver like cleanses,
colonics and things like
colonics.
That.
Yeah. Like,
I was more referring to, Mike, like I was more referring to in like, we could have a tendency, like if you look at ratios in a restaurant right now, if we went out and we ordered steaks and like we get like a 16 or 24 ounce steak and like a little side of like maybe 3 asparagus or something like that. And I'm like, flip that ratio, like eat a little side of meat and like a whole bunch of
asparagus. Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, in terms of what we eat in diet, and that's the point, is that, protein, let's get back to this conversation of protein. Like, what do we need protein for? Right? What is it that we actually need it for? We need it for our growth. We need it for, maintenance, because as you're building up and breaking down, you need to, fill in some of those gaps. And you need it for the repair and maintenance, part of the similar process. But you also need it for rapid growth. That's why, young child, as they're going through adolescence, they're going to be eating a lot more. They're going to be getting a lot more food into their diet, which inherently means they're going to be getting in more amino acids, more proteins, as long as they're eating a balanced diet, of course. But that's really the primary use for protein. It's for repair, building, growth, maintenance. There's no energy involved in that. There's no, like, in terms of what it's used for, it's not used. You didn't hear me use the word energy. Carbohydrates are used for energy. And then we'll talk a little bit about fatty acids next time that could be used for energy. But people who are on these super high protein diets that are getting more protein than their body actually requires, they're not going to, well, they can still use certain types of amino acids for energy production, but it's a really inefficient way to create energy that's also going to lead to more of these nitrogenous compounds that are going to lead more to that decay, the decay and degeneration. They create a lot of acidity within the body that's going to pull a lot of our resources, and also draw from our enzyme reserves and energy reserves to process that out. So, what we want to focus on with protein is that it's found abundantly in all sorts of foods. And yes, if you're going to have your plate and you want to include some animal-based food, that's your choice. You can do that. But should it be, as you're saying, that large steak with a little side of your vegetables, or should that ratio be reversed? And I'm totally with you, 100% that ratio ought to be reversed, that we should be focusing more on plants while minimizing the animal-based foods. Again, you can include some of it if that's what you like, and also that you feel good with. And there's a time and a place for it. So, I personally come from a perspective as it's can be used for certain therapeutic benefits, but let's stick mostly to a whole food plant-based diet, because as long as you're eating whole foods, you can get every single carbohydrate, vitamin, mineral, protein, fatty acid that you need to repair the body.
So, Mike, before we get off today, for time purposes, I want to give the audience something really practical, and myself something really practical. So if I'm like, I'm going to go train tonight, I'm going to go do jujitsu in a little while.
Yeah.
Now, fats and steak and chicken and even avocado, fats right now may not give me the best source of energy. Is that accurate?
Yeah, especially since your body's primarily set up to be burning carbohydrates, unless you've shifted your metabolism to a fat-burning metabolism.
How would I have done that?
That's what's really popular right now, is this ketogenic diet that's being, popularized, talked about a lot.
But even if I did, it's not as efficient.
It's not, to me, it's not as efficient in the long term. It could have some therapeutic benefits in the short term, and there is literature to support that, and especially for certain conditions. But we need to support our body with these carbohydrates to give us the carbon that we can get our body going to support the carbon side of the carbon nitrogen cycle for growth and for development and for energy.
What would you recommend for like pre-workout, or like something right now, not too heavy, or maybe I should have eaten an hour or two ago, but what do you recommend? Is it the rice? Is it potatoes? Is it like, what do you recommend that these carbohydrates are?
Well, I mean, ultimately everybody's different in terms of what they may need, but generally, yeah, you're talking about everything from fresh fruits, non-starchy vegetables, which I definitely feel should comprise the majority of our plate. Get in maybe some complex carbohydrate that can be in the form of a concentrated starch. These can all be really, an important part of your diet to help support your life energy and your overall health and well-being. One of the problems, though, that this is why carbohydrates have gotten a bad reputation, is because people have literally blown out their pancreas and their other organ systems and enzymes that are responsible for processing carbohydrates. So when people consume something like a potato or any other type of carbohydrate, starchy food, their blood sugar goes up. Now, if you had the right foods especially from childhood, that were whole foods, that had all the proper essential coenzymes, cofactors to be able to process those foods, and the right enzyme reserves in the pancreas and in other organ systems to process the food and metabolize those carbohydrates, we wouldn't have problems. But because we have been growing up in a generation, especially an era where the food is nutrient depleted, we're having lots of toxins and chemicals that are literally antagonizing and destroying our organs. That's interfering with our metabolism of carbohydrates and sugars. So to me, it's not an issue of the cause is the carbohydrate in and of itself. And that's like where we get so linear in our thinking.
Yeah.
Oh, I eat a carbohydrate, makes the blood sugar go up. Therefore, the problem is carbohydrate. And that is such a linear way of thinking, and that is causing us to seek drugs as treatment and to seek other kinds of relatively extreme diets in order to counter that effect. But we really have to basically bathe ourselves in proper nutrition.
Yeah.
And that means eating nutrient dense food to get our energy, our enzyme levels and reserves up to an optimal level in every single organ system of the body, so that we can function as a really efficient human being, not only in body, but in mind, in our emotional state, in our spiritual state. Be a united, unified being. That's really what we're after. And, to go back to protein, that when we, one of the problems when we eat too much protein, the excess of protein in our diet, is what can that often lead to is things like inflammation, because for a number of reasons. One with that is that when we take in too much protein, especially if it's larger proteins that are not able to be digested, absorbed and assimilated into our body, then these proteins are circulating in our blood and in our congest in our lymphatic, and then congest in other organs of the body. And then this will create an immunological response where you have what's called these immune circulating complexes that will bind to those proteins, because it's a whole protein that hasn't been eaten and is now eating you. And it's starting to create a huge immunological distress, which is going to create a lot of inflammation and degeneration. So that's one issue with too much protein. Another is mineral deficiencies. You take too much protein, you're going to need a lot of minerals to process that. And also the effect of having too many proteins, which then break down to, made up of amino acids, it's inherently has more of an acidic nature, whereas minerals are more alkaline. And so since we're finding that balance of acid base, you're going to pull a lot of minerals like calcium, magnesium, potassium in order to buffer that acidic load from that acidic, food source.
It's going to pull that from your bones and places it probably shouldn't.
All your tissues, exactly. You're going to spend a tremendous amount of resources in order to get from the meat, from the highly concentrated protein that you may be consuming, the excess amounts. So we need protein, no doubt about it, but our needs are not as high as many out there would like us to think. You only need it for, again, repair, for growth. So
post-workout sounds like, before I go to jiu-jitsu, we can talk about, and we're not making any recommendations for diet. This is just for myself and Mike, where you guys figured out. We're not saying or one way or the other. But maybe some like ground up cauliflower, rice, like asparagus, like just eat some awesome fruits and vegetables, give my body something to clean it out from the inside, and some good carbohydrates, and some maybe not cook so much. So it's got some real good enzymes to regenerate with.
Right on.
And then post workout, maybe I can throw back like my Sun Warrior protein with a banana or something like that, or if I want to eat some meat or something like that. And again, limit the intake so it's not too much overload, but post workout so I can get that repair.
Yeah, absolutely. And ultimately what you really want is you want enzymatically rich foods. So enzymes, again, are proteins. So the proteins we ought to be getting in should be a lot of enzymes, because those enzymes are going to help not only digest the food, but also spare our body to, have its enzymes be used for repair of the muscle tissue that maybe you broke down during your workout. And so if you want to have that quicker repair, you got to support the enzyme activity.
Got it.
And you want to be getting in, I would say, lots of more alkaline based foods, a lot of dark leafy greens, which are going to be blood purifiers, working on the lymphatic system as well, to help wash away those acidic wastes that have just been released as a result of breaking down your own cells. This is when you go and you work out with weights, anything intense, you're creating little micro tears and break a little micro damage within our muscle cells. And so you got to repair that, but you also have to wash away all of the wastes from the cellular damage that has just occurred.
Got it.
So that's where, the more plant-based foods we consume, the better. Eating a lot of greens, a lot of chlorophyll, it's going to be tremendously supportive of your recovery.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Mike, this was like a complex carbohydrate, Mike. It's just like really,
Yeah.
This was super dense, man. I got to go back, listen to this. I suggest everyone goes back and listens to all the episodes. If you just caught us on this one that we've done so far, take some notes, because it's just going to get deeper and deeper as we go, man.
Yeah. And we'll always come back. We'll always come back to other talks and content and start linking things together like we did in this conversation.
But I'm going to listen to this, Mike, and maybe we can do just another day on carbohydrates and proteins review, enzymes, because it sounds like, what was it? Peptids?
Well, yeah. So amino acids can be formed into peptides, polypeptides.
Because I see that polypeptides and peptides on like the collagen that we use.
Right.
And it's like, that's like a big marketing thing now. So I wanted to get into that. I have questions on that. I have questions to get more on the amino acids now we've created.
We'll continue our part 2 of protein into fats.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Awesome, Mike. Mike, thank you as always. And,
thank you.
Thank you guys for listening, and we'll see you guys all next week. Peace out.
Peace.